to the KrakCast. We are here today to discuss the BCG vaccine. It's a very interesting topic that has come to the attention of everybody this week, reading about the striking statistical correlation between countries that use blanket immunization with BCG and countries that don't. And there seems to be a 10-to-1 ratio, I heard the University of Texas study put it at, which seems striking, Mike, and it seems like a possible good news story since this vaccine is one of the most well-known, well-understood medicines that we have out
Sorry,
there.
Dave, for what purpose is this vaccine helping us? You mean with the COVID-19?
Yes, that will be the one. Sorry, I mean, we're all so deep into COVID weeds. I think people know what we're talking about already. But yes, sorry, Josh, just to clarify, we were talking about a vaccine. BCG is a vaccine. I was going to pass it over to Mikey to do the little history piece on it. So,
well, yeah, BCG, which is used for immunization against tuberculosis. It's an acronym because it has two French names in it that nobody can ever really remember. It's Bacillus Calmette-Guerin. I'm going to put that aside now because I sucked at French, and I'm just going to refer to it as BCG from now on, as the proper world does. There has been a lot of studies out there, correlative studies, suggesting that there might be a positive influence in populations that had this program of...
it was originally the TB vaccine, right?
Yes, originally, and still is, the TB vaccine, given to children shortly after birth. At least that was a program, but not in every country and not in every population. It's been done differently over the last few decades. It was originally developed and first put to use in the early part of the 20th century. So 100 years ago now, it's going to be 1921. And it's an attenuated version of Myconium bacterium, but a certain type, a cow version of this. It's not the tuberculosis you get, but it's actually a bovine version of this Mycobacterium, which has been attenuated. That means it's been weakened over several generations of growing it in lab cultures to the point where it doesn't cause any type of symptoms, but it does cause an immune response in people that hopefully gives them protection for some time after it's been applied to them. The studies on this, though, are all over the place. And also, this doesn't protect against respiratory tuberculosis in adults. It seems to protect more children, especially from meningitis caused by TB and other similar infections. And it only, in the best case scenario, shows it usually lasts about 20 years or so. But still, a large population of children have been saved over the last 100 years thanks to this vaccine. It was developed, as I mentioned, in the early part of the 20th century, and it was one of those things that they started working on as soon as they realized that vaccines were a thing. Vaccines, they realized, were a thing back at the end of the 18th century. So, we're talking 1700s here, when they noticed that milkmaids who were exposed to cowpox were then, protected against smallpox, a disease that ravaged populations for centuries. And after some trial and error, they realized that if they gave people cowpox intentionally, they would have a mild disease, and then would be defended against smallpox. And this became the first vaccine. The word vaccine actually comes from a Latin root that has to do with cows. And this was the first vaccine. 100 years later, in the 19th century, they've developed a more, say, medical type of strain of smallpox, cowpox, which allowed for, these injections to be passed around and for less symptoms and problems. But they also, scientists started realizing, well, what about this tuberculosis that attacks cows? Maybe if we give that to people, it will protect them from tuberculosis. So in the 19th century, they started playing around with that. And first trials weren't so good because it turns out that the bovine equivalent of tuberculosis is as virulent and can be as deadly to people as the regular type of Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, you had some French doctors getting together and growing different strains, hoping to weaken it and attenuate it to a point where it would not actually cause diseases. And then just after World War II, they finally were able to grow and culture a batch of this type of bacteria. And at the beginning of the 1920s, they started to actually distribute it. And there were, some problems at the beginning. People weren't too confident in this. There was one scenario where apparently the attenuated strains were mixed in with the full-blown version, causing deaths to children that had been vaccinated. And it wasn't until after World War II that large-scale and international programs started to apply tuberculosis immunization. And this helped because usually after world wars, you get a huge influx of diseases, tuberculosis among them. And after using this vaccine, numbers drastically dropped, especially in Eastern Europe. But this was, to a large extent, one of the main parts of the world where they really went all in with this type of immunization program.
Mm-hmm. So it's more that better medicines and different medicines came along to treat. For instance, we don't use the smallpox vaccine anymore. There's no reason. So there's nothing kind of malicious behind the fact that countries stopped using it. Except for, I noticed an interesting fact on the Wikipedia page, Mike. There's a list of. We'll get to the comparative study as well in the countries in a moment, but I was asking myself, if it's one of those vaccines where we know it gives certain benefits and it certainly can't harm to give it to people, why not have a blanket program? And I kept coming across this thing about supply and the cost effectiveness of BCG. And it said that, in the 50s when they brought this in, in fact, saying vaccinating 94 people in the UK would have made one case of tuberculosis go away, and now it has to be something like 12,000. And because the drug isn't cheap and it's harder to get now, it seems to me, was there a cost imperative from getting rid of it, or was it more, a genuine medical, upgrade on that technology where we felt we had different vaccination programs that were complete anyway?
Well, you have to remember with this type of vaccination, this is for a bacterial infection, because we're talking all the time about COVID right now, coronavirus and smallpox. These are viral infections with their own types of treatments and vaccinations. With bacterial infections, you also, or used to anyway, have the possibility of treating them with antibiotics. And in the 20th century, antibiotic treatment exploded as a very effective measure to fight tuberculosis. So you had countries like the United States, which never had large-scale TB outbreaks to begin with. And then you had treatment for tuberculosis with antibiotics. And if you had widespread inoculation against tuberculosis, well, the problem is the inoculation causes a reaction in the body that when you want to do one of the types of tests to see if somebody has been infected with tuberculosis or suffers from latent tuberculosis, it will come out positive in a lot of cases if they've been inoculated before. And then you don't know what type of treatment you should do if the person's actually sick. Have they been inoculated before or just exposed to it? So the calculation was that, well, it's better not to inoculate our population, so we have this diagnostic procedure available to us, because then we can still treat it with antibiotics.
It just seems extraordinary to me as a layman, because of all these studies that show it's this weird effect that it has, that it boosts the immune system overall, unlike other vaccines. And we've used it for so long. Why we stopped? I just, as a layman, I get the argument you're making. Better antibiotics came along and that, but if it had been dirt cheap and easily available, do you think every country would have stopped giving it? Or I just have a feeling.
Actually, it is quite cheap. It's basically a freeze-dried powder that can be stored in almost any type of conditions as long as it's dry and cool. You just mix it with some saline and, Bob's your uncle. You have like a Kool-Aid version of a vaccine that you can distribute it quite easily. The problem here is, like I was saying, when you have a population that's been inoculated, that gives rid of a strong diagnostic tool. That's one. And second of all, it has been shown to be effective in certain cases in certain populations, with, like I was saying, in children, but in adults, and especially for respiratory tuberculosis, not really beneficial at all. And there have been studies showing in large populations where it hasn't had any effectiveness whatsoever. There seems to be a weird correlation with geography here, that the closer a population is to the equator, the less likely this is to work. Some of the reasons that they think about this is that people in those latitudes are more likely to be exposed to other types of bacteria, mycobacterium, which cause the effectiveness of the vaccine to be weaker. That's one of the theories. There's also different strains of tuberculosis and different strains used in the actual vaccine, and they might not gel properly as well, so the coverage isn't quite clear. And when you don't know what you're dealing with, as in you don't know how it would work in a certain population, just giving out in a blanket way like that might not be, it might not cause harm, but it might not cause benefit as well. And as I said, it definitely poses problems with future diagnostic techniques.
Well, it's just from my layman's perspective, Mikey. I'm looking at this list of countries. Italy never had a mass program. They're in the shit. Portugal and Poland did, and the rate seems to be so much lower here. It just seems like these comparisons go all the way around the world. Countries that have these mass programs. What did you think of the kind of statistical evidence linking it? I mean, and importantly, man, with your knowledge, please do point out the potential caveats to any statistical study like this.
The caveats are the main thing that need to be talked about here.
Yeah.
There definitely seems to be some kind of connection or correlation in populations that have widespread inoculation programs and their ability to deal with COVID-19. The thing is, there are just so many possible factors. A lot of these studies try to rule out different types of factors, but you never know. And just basing future treatment on correlative studies is risky until you know the actual mechanism behind the results that you're looking at. We have different populations, different age groups, different topography, geography, diets, different bacterial flora. And those are just the things that we know that are different. There are other things that we might not realize that are different that might be having impact. I'm not saying that this shouldn't be studied. It should definitely be studied, but it shouldn't be automatically assumed that the vaccine in of itself is what's providing the protection.
Yeah, no, I mean, there is a feeling that the possible ray of hope here could be that it provides a stopgap, half measure, it's something that's effective in general against this type of respiratory illness. And there are trials going on in the medical community all around the world. It really ramped up quickly. So in the next few months, we should start to get some really good evidence from Australia, from Denmark, Germany, the UK, the US. I think, Mikey, and another thing I wanted to talk about is the effect of BCG. When you have certain types of chemotherapy and your immune system is at its weakest, they inject this into you, right, as well. I mean, isn't it fair to say that there's always been a feeling amongst doctors that, we don't properly understand BCG, and that, it is worth studying more because it seems to have a wide array of uses.
Well, of course, it's definitely worth studying because it does seem to have an influence on the immune system other than its protection against tuberculosis. I would always be, cautiously optimistic in this type of situations, a little more reserved, but you don't go all head in and concentrate on this without realizing that there might be other factors. It's been shown, our understanding of medicine, is vastly superior to 200 years ago when vaccinations were first being discussed and introduced. But there's, we know a lot more, but we also know what we don't know. And then, there's also that saying of not knowing what you don't know. And we're brutally aware of that. One thing I'd like to mention is, gastric ulcers, stomach ulcers. For the longest time period, they were considered, mainly due to stress, bad diet, etc., until a couple of Australian doctors in the 1980s started giving their patients antibiotics. And they were cured. They were laughed out, but they ended up getting a Nobel Prize for it because it turns out that a bulk of gastric ulcers were caused by H. pylori bacteria. You could actually treat it with antibiotics. No reason for surgery to take it out. No type of anti-acid treatment needed. So there are a lot of things going on in your body that are a result of other factors than we might consider. And sometimes when you use a medication for one type of disease, it kind of, just by chance might treat something else. As the situation where BCG is always used for bladder cancer, as you were saying, and during chemotherapy, there are benefits in these situations when you know that the medication itself doesn't cause anything that much of a risk or harm to the body, and there's been signs showing that it could cause a benefit. So when you don't have anything else to do, then you go into your arsenal and look at these other things that might have some benefits. There's a lot of money and a lot of resources being now used to study all these other weird kind of treatments. One of them is, of course, the anti-malaria that's being treated, which a lot of people don't realize is used not only against malaria, but in autoimmune diseases because it has, especially say in juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, because it has an effect on the immune system. And this is why some people are saying that maybe it also helps in certain cases of COVID-19. I'm not 100% convinced by that, but I definitely think it's another one of those things worth considering and studying. And when a doctor has a patient dying and they don't know what to do, then you kind of can argue for, okay, let's just try these random things that I've heard about on Facebook because I've got nothing else to lose at this moment.
I'll tell you something, Mikey. I'll tell you something though. I've had a genius flash of inspiration though. When the global economy collapses, that's when I'm getting this on your radar early. You know, I have a brilliant business plan for me and you, Mike and Dave's BCG Smoothie Shack. Okay, we're gonna go big on this. We're gonna cut the other two out, right? You know, they can be servers if they want. I'll handle the customers. You give it the credibility of your credentials, and we'll make it forward. What do you think?
Especially considering that the early BCG vaccines were given orally, so it's definitely quite possible to, have this in some kind of edible format.
I'm a genius. Yeah, now look, Mikey, I have to say, I wanted to discuss this because I knew recording this would be quite good to get your perspective on it, and you've made some really interesting points there. I think, in terms of what I wanted to cover, that was pretty much it, Josh. I'm conscious I didn't, bring in much there. Excuse me, how rude. Zoom was really bringing me off my game here. You, any thoughts and recollections from when the vaccine came out?
Yeah. Because of course I was there. I was there for the earliest trials in the 1920s. Thank you very much. I won't forget that little thing. Yeah, it was actually to give us some idea of the time scale. I think this was also before Jacek Majchrowski took over as president of Krakow. I can actually. I mean, I had a BCG jab when I was, I think, about age 11 or something like that, and we were all very excited about it because it was a new type of, when you're at primary school or first year of secondary school, there's not much you can get excited about. So
you were just glad that they weren't giving you leeches and bloodletting.
Yeah. It was staunching my gaping wound with a red hot poker, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, look, I think we've brought this episode to a conclusion, but I think it'll be worthy of a follow up. Maybe we'll keep an eye on the story in the next 6 to 8 weeks. Hopefully, there are some interesting developments, and we can come back to this. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you for having us.